morning and welcome to the Vanderbilt Divinity School and to the 2011 Cole Lectures. I'm James Hudnut-Boimler, and it is my honor as Dean of the Divinity School to welcome you to this lecture and to the second installment tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. back here at the same location. The Cole Lectures were established by Colonel E.W. Cole in 1893 for the defense and advocacy of the Christian religion. Since the time of Colonel Cole's gift, the lectures have been given by a wide variety of outstanding Christian thinkers, and tonight's lecture would certainly reward our donor's gift. For Scott Appleby is a scholar of rare distinction in the field of religion. Moreover, that provision in Colonel Cole's legacy about defense of religion is closely related to the theme of this year's lectures. Professor Appleby was trained as an American religious historian with Martin Marty at the University of Chicago, but from the very beginning of his career, he took on a note of engagement with issues and phenomena that matter to the world outside history, narrowly conceived. He first became known for his work on the massive fundamentalism project, where he was co-director. And while he was analyzing the global resurgence of anti-modernist religion, he was also writing Church and Age Unite, the modernist impulse in American Catholicism, a collection. Being Right, Conservative Catholics in America followed. Appleby is the author and/or editor of several books, including Strong Religion, The Ambivalence of the Sacred, Religion, Violence, and Reconciliation, a book that is often taught here at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and Spokesmen for the Despised, Fundamentalist Leaders of the Middle East. Again and again, Appleby has chosen to use his academic gifts to ask the age-old question, what are the things that make for peace? He's the lead editor of the Oxford University Press book series, Studies in Strategic Peace Building, and co-editor of the forthcoming OUP Handbook on Religion, Conflict, and Peace Building. And as director of the Kroc Institute, he established the Catholic Peace Building Network. He's also director of the multidisciplinary project Contending Modernities, Catholic, Muslim, and secular. We're fortunate then to have with us a person of faith, a scholar of religion, violence, and peace, and a peacemaker in his own right, to address us on the ambivalence of the sacred, religion as a source of violent and nonviolent militants. After the lecture and a brief question and answer period, there'll be a reception for all in the Divinity School refectory on this floor in that direction, and we welcome you all to that reception. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming Professor Appleby.
This is an intimidating platform to speak from. I've got two mics going, so maybe that echo will be appropriate for the forum. I want to thank Dean Hudnut-Boimler, Shatika, the staff, and the people who've invited me and hosted me so graciously. I'm honored to be here, and I'm going to get started so we can have some time, I hope, for questions and discussion at the end of this lecture, at which point I'll descend from the mountain here and come down among you all. As Jim said, the title of my presentation is The Ambivalence of the Sacred, Religion as a Source of Violent and Nonviolent Militants. And the questions that we've posed for this presentation are, is religion a unique or even distinctive source of violence in the world? And if militance is a religious norm, why do some militant religions kill and others heal? Or I should say, why do some militant religious actors or believers kill while others heal? These questions seem to be critically relevant for scholars of religion, of course, but also for the general public, and not least educators at all levels, as well as diplomats, policymakers, and public officials. For example, in international and national policy circles, serious or committed religion is often conflated with fundamentalism, to the pride of some of the fundamentalists who consider the rest of us compromisers and thus lukewarm believers at best. So some in the fundamentalist side of the spectrum would say, great, if they want to associate true religion with fundamentalism, we kind of claim that's accurate. But it only is a slice, of course, of the American religious or world religious landscape. But in policy circles, that tends to be the slice or the segment of the religious terrain, if you will, that people lift up and characterize and caricature. In these policy circles, the assumption lingers that religion itself is a security threat and, quote, the source of destabilization to the national and international order, as one recent U.S. government policy document put it. Happily, thanks to the Luce Foundation and to other civic organizations, there have been efforts afoot, and they've taken place at Vanderbilt and at many universities around the country to disseminate a more sophisticated understanding of religion and religious dynamics than has obtained in the past in our own governmental policy circles. Even if you think in terms of national security interests for the United States, and of course, not all scholars or religious leaders share those priorities, but just thinking in terms of national security, government responses might have been different and more successful even in kind of the metric of protecting and advancing U.S. or European interest had our officials, our policymakers, our leaders in government better understood, say, the internal dynamics of Sunni and Shiite communities in pre-invasion Iraq. Since we had been so bad at understanding religion before the invasion of Iraq, some of our government officials were pretty proud of themselves that they understood there were Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq. They did not get the fact that there are different kinds of Shiites. There are some ayatollahs, Ayatollah Sistani, who's more a different kind of leader, a somewhat apolitical leader, but certainly with political influence. And there's Muqtada al-Sadr, who's a radical Shiite cleric. We had to learn that lesson on the ground, sometimes to the loss of American lives. If we'd known that, if we'd understood Iranian religious culture prior to and following the revolution in 1979 led by Ayatollah Khomeini, or the role of the Catholic Church in the spread of democracy in Latin America, Poland, and elsewhere, or the psychology and motivations of religious Jews who pioneered and continue to settle the illegal settlements on the West Bank in Israel, Palestine, and so on. You could replicate the list of decisions that have been better informed and more prudent and had greater positive impact if there had been a shrewder understanding of the internal dynamics of religion. The influence of religion on individual and collective action in the public sphere, however, can no longer be underestimated. Over the last decade, since 9/11 really, government officials have taken note and have recognized that they've just established a new and one of the more sophisticated State Department circles of academics and religious leaders to try to help the government better understand the dynamics of religion and also to be able to discriminate among religious actors in a positive way and to form alliances with religious groups for the common good, both nationally and internationally. Treating religion in a nuanced way is very much a part of getting the world right these days, and people recognize that. There was an important book on this topic that was published a few years ago called The Politics of Secularism in International Relations by a scholar now at Northwestern named Elizabeth Hurd. She criticized the secular bias that distorts most policy conversation and too many public discussions of religion. Conventional understandings of international relations and world affairs have focused on material capabilities, on states, on strategic interaction, and have excluded from the start the possibility that religion could be a fundamental organizing force in the international system. The secularist division between religion on one hand and politics on the other is not fixed, Hurd argues, but rather socially and historically constructed, and therefore we can begin to reconstruct that relation between religion and politics so that we can better overcome puzzles such as the conflict between the United States and Iran, controversy over the enlargement of the European Union to include Turkey, which is perceived as a Muslim nation, not to be trusted by some members of the Union, the rise of political Islam, and the broader religious resurgence over the past several decades in Israel, India, the United States, and elsewhere. The authoritative forms of secularism that dominate modern politics are themselves constructions. They are created by secular, and they're based on secular and religious assumptions about ethics and politics. From this perspective, Hurd writes, not only is religion on its way back into international affairs, it never really departed. That is, our political leaders, our policy leaders are beginning to recognize that religion is at the heart of what people believe, how they behave, how they organize their politics. And this sometimes appears to them as a new insight, but in fact they're beginning to realize it's always been the case. This evening, what I'd like to do is lay the groundwork for tomorrow morning's exploration of some of the patterns of religious violence that are evident in conflicts today. I do think we can speak about religion. And yes, I believe that religion and religion is implicated in acts of deadly violence around the world. Why do I say these things which might sound obvious to you? Because they're contested by some scholars. These scholars would say secular forces, especially states, nation states, they are the ones who perpetrate violence on a larger and more devastating scale than religious actors do. And of course, that's true. If we did a survey, and they've been done, and a study of the kinds of horrific violence, including the killing of innocent people, that occurred over the last 50 to 70 years, you'd find that secular states, non-religious entities, are the perpetrators of the vast majority of terrible violence around the world. So yes, we can recognize that. And these critics of religion and religious violence say, religion as we understand it today is a modern construct. We made it up. One that was furthermore imposed on colonized peoples by the colonizers of the West. Again, that's true. In other words, the category of religion, the understanding of religion as a force in its own right, separate from the economy, from other professions, from government, or having complicated relations with those other units or sectors of society, that notion of religion is indeed a modern construct, a modern way of thinking about religion. And it's developed over several centuries. But when we recognize this, that yes, religion is a construct, and yes, there are other actors in the world who do violence, which these claims are the basis of a recent book by a theologian named William Cavanaugh, who wrote a book called The Myth of Religious Violence. But those facts don't inevitably lead to Professor Cavanaugh's conclusion that there's no such thing as religious violence. You can call me hopelessly bound to time and place, but the medieval notion of religion as permeating the whole of life and not separated into its own sectors and institutions simply doesn't describe the world today, at least the world of violent conflict. The fact is, religion has its own institutions, its own dynamics, its own patterns, and they interact in very complicated, ways with secular or non-religious institutions. And so we can identify and describe not only religions and religion, but violence committed in the name of religion or legitimated by religion. While these lectures will focus on religion and violence, I will have a word to say, and I hope to say more about it in our discussion, about religion and nonviolence, and indeed about modern religious actors who are working effectively and in new coalitions and with new methods to build peace, to enhance compassion and forgiveness and tolerance. I'm going to say a few words about that dynamic as well. Indeed, the heart of our discussion here is the basic, simple, but difficult question to answer: how adherents of the same religious tradition, whether Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, or Mormonism, including adherents of any one of these religions who live within the same national or regional or local political and cultural context, how can those believers embrace both deadly violence and nonviolent militants for peace? How do we explain the phenomena of Christians killing other Christians and non-Christians, and also producing from the same community people who would lay down their lives to give witness to nonviolence, to forgiveness, to love of enemy? How can these traditions produce such extremes? And we could make the claim fairly arbitrarily that, say, the people who do violence in the name of Islam, they're not real Muslims, or who do violence in the name of Christianity, they're not really Christians. But in fact, some of the people who do violence in the name of these traditions do so with reference to their scriptures, to ethical traditions, to the teaching of religious leaders. It's too facile, it's too easy to say, well, they're not really Muslims, they're not really Christians. That's a mistake. The question is, how do we understand the ways in which they believe themselves to be not only Muslims or Christians or Jews or Hindus, but in fact, the most orthodox, the true believers, the righteous among those larger traditions? Why do they make these claims? So we begin, as historians and sociologists and cultural anthropologists and religion scholars would, by recognizing that there is no such thing as Christianity. There is no such thing as Islam. There's no such thing as Judaism or Buddhism. Rather, there are Buddhisms, Christianities, Judaisms, Islams, and so on. One of the messages tonight is a simple one, but it's very important for what follows. These large, multi-generational religious traditions that are now geographically diverse and all increasingly globalized, you find them everywhere, from Detroit to Jakarta. These traditions are internally plural, as I'll explain in a moment. They are pluriform, they're multiple in their expressions, and they are internally contested. So we can't speak of Christianity as if we know what we're talking about on the ground. We can talk about doctrines and teachings and practices, but even then, there's such a breathtaking diversity of examples or instantiations of what Christianity means around the world today that we have to speak about these traditions in the plural. To explain the significance of this claim and why it's true, I want to explore this evening three concepts about religion that help explain the coexistence of Gandhi and his Hindu nationalist assassin, Jesus, and bullets with Bible verses inscribed on them, Buddha, and the Sinhalese monks who campaigned for the annihilation of the Tamils in Sri Lanka, and so on. How do we get at this phenomenon? These three concepts, basic concepts, are these. First, militance as a religious norm. Second, hermeneutics and ambivalence. There had to be a 25-cent word in there. Hermeneutics and ambivalence. And finally, internal pluralism and the choices of leaders, the choices made by leaders. So let me go through these three concepts quickly for you to give you kind of some language we can share to talk about other issues tonight and tomorrow. So let's begin with this first concept, militance as a religious norm. The idea that to be militant is to be religious. The Cole lectures were established in 1892, as you've heard, by Colonel E.W. Cole for the defense and advocacy of the Christian religion. Previous scholars in this distinguished series have included Paul Tillich. And Tillich's definition of religion as ultimate concern is a good place to begin the discussion of religion as a militant mode of being. To be pursued and captured by what you believe to be the ultimate reality in the universe is to render all other goods, including your loved ones, your family, your community, even religion itself, render those things penultimate, subordinate to whatever is considered to be the ultimate or final, all-encompassing reality. The human person is capable of ultimate concern. That is, we are each capable of investing something or someone or some idea with an unconditional, absolute meaning, and then we are capable of giving ourselves utterly to that person or thing or idea. Thus, Tillich warned us that the investor's choice of investment, what to invest in, so to speak, is crucial. Investing one's capacity for an almost unlimited devotion, that is, investing, to use theological language, one's uncreated soul into a created reality, risks self-destruction. Penultimate realities, realities that are not the ultimate reality, that masquerade as God, Tillich called pseudo-religions. And he included the modern nation-state, modern nationalism as a pseudo-religion, various modern utopias or schemes for the fulfillment of history such as Marxism. Tillich said these all function as religions because they exact a claim upon us, upon their adherents, on their followers, to give an ultimate concern and ultimate loyalty and devotion and subordinate family and home and livelihood. So we're talking about religion as a matter of ultimacy. Ultimacy, in turn, is a recipe for militants. Now, by militants, I mean for dedicated, disciplined, often self-sacrificial commitment without qualification. That's what I mean by militant. Dedication, self-sacrifice, unqualified commitment. Consider how common such expressions of absolute commitment are in history, religious and non-religious history. But let's look at the religious. Iranian mothers sent their children in their teens, their boys and some girls, across landmines in the war against Iraq in the 1980s. They sent their children so the children would step on landmines and be killed. That would clear the way for the Iranian military to proceed safely through those landmines. How do we understand this? We can say those Iranian mothers are fanatics. We can say that they're deluded, they don't love their children. All of these claims don't get to the heart of what's going on there. What's going on there is, one way to construe it is a commitment to a reality that they feel is somehow even more important in the lives of their children, and that somehow the best way to even love their children, their families, is to risk and sacrifice their children's lives. To say they didn't love their children doesn't get the point. Martyrdom, which is a feature in so many religions, certainly in Christianity, is seen as a religious duty, an honor, a privilege. I grew up, went to Catholic schools in the 1960s, and I know I don't look that old, but I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the nuns told us, I never quite understood why we were told to hide under the desks, as if the desk would somehow protect us from a nuclear explosion. But we actually did get under the desk. And we were told, and not just in Shreveport, Louisiana, sometimes my students at Notre Dame think how Gothic the South must be, that they told you these things there. And I said, no, this was the Catholic, and it was told everywhere. We were told if the Soviets, the godless communists, should overrun this country, that we would be privileged if we had our back against the wall with their guns to our heads, in which they asked us, do you believe in Jesus Christ or do you deny him? And it would be our privilege to be martyred on the spot. We could pray for such a swift ascent to heaven because we had given ourselves self-sacrificially to martyr ourselves to Christ. The notion of asceticism, ascesis, is in fact self-discipline, giving oneself and putting everything, subordinating everything to the discipline that leads one open to the way of God. As I've mentioned, we send our children, our sons and daughters to war in the name of the nation. We're willing to make ultimate sacrifice. So an authentic religious mode then, and some scholars would say the authentic religious mode is militance, unconditional devotion to God. In scare quotes here because that term, I'm using it comparatively, and the term is not used in the same way by all religions, but many religions are focused on this militant devotion. If you are lukewarm, I spit you out of my mouth, the New Testament has Jesus saying. Give away everything you have and follow me. The Buddha followed this path of forsaking all others, as did holy men and women down through the ages and the traditions. Renunciation and militance in this mode can be described, writes the political scientist Charles Lieberman, as a religious norm. So we begin our quest to understand religious violence and religious peacemaking by understanding that these actors are militants. And this caused me, as I was studying and writing about this, to ask, am I a religious militant? I'm a believer. Would I give up my life if I'm a militant? And I consider myself more of a religious bureaucrat. That is, I'm not so sure that I want to be a religious militant, so I might be lukewarm. But many in the world are, in fact, militant and would say one is not religious if one is not militant. Now, when you use a term like militant or extremist, much less something like fundamentalist, you have to define your terms, because those terms are thrown around and used in so many different ways. So I use the term in a particular way. I'm using militant encompassingly across a spectrum of religious attitudes and practices toward violence. That is, at one end of this spectrum, we find those who I would call nonviolent militants, or militants for peace. These are the believers who say, I'm willing to sacrifice myself, but not do violence to anyone else, and try to avoid it in the case, I'm not asking for martyrdom, but we prioritize forgiveness, reconciliation, compassion for the other. These are the believers in all of the traditions who eschew violence, who reject it in all forms as antithetical to the will of God. At the other end of this spectrum of militants are those religious militants who commit violence out of a sense of obligation. Eliminating the enemy, the apostate, or the non-believer, to these people is a religious duty. It's enjoined by the sacred. They don't have a choice. It's their obligation. I refer to these types of militants who do violence as a matter of principle and policy, so to speak, as religious extremists. So when I use the term extremist, I mean those militants who say, my militancy will be expressed in doing violence to the non-believer or to the apostate or to the enemy of the true faith. Of course, along this spectrum, there are many points. There are just warriors and jihadists who set and follow strict conditions for making war, who will do violence under limited condition. There are pacifists toward the other end of the spectrum, pacifists who expect the state or civil authorities to maintain order through coercion and violence as necessary, and so on. I had a colleague who's passed away now for over a year, over 10 years, John Howard Yoder, a very important disciple of pacifism from the Mennonite tradition. I had gotten to long arguments. I said, so if someone broke in and threatened your family, you wouldn't protect them? No, I wouldn't protect them. I'm the disciple of Jesus Christ. Well, would you just let them be slaughtered? No, I expect the police to come in and protect them and to take care. Well, that's getting you off the hook, isn't it? Well, that's right. There are two kingdoms, and the police are in one, and I'm in the other. Now, that may not be fair to Professor Yoder, but he can correct me later. I'm sure he will. In this talk, I'm most interested in the extremes, for they illuminate the whole. Why do some believers embrace nonviolence and spiritualize, as they do, the concepts of war, crusade, jihad? You'll find many of the nonviolent religious actors talking about crusade, talking about war, talking about jihad, but they mean it nonviolently. Gandhi said, nonviolence is a crusade. I prefer it because it's more effective. But if it's a matter of cowardice, I'll do violence. It's not about cowardice. It's about a disciplined commitment and a spiritual quest that is the quest of a warrior. He used that kind of language. But he felt that violent expression of it was an ineffective, lesser version of the real spiritual task. Indeed, with each of the great multi-generational religious traditions, one can trace a moral trajectory challenging adherents to greater acts of compassion, nonviolence, forgiveness, and to delegitimate what they call the demonic competing voices who call for revenge and retaliation, for inquisition and persecution of enemies. It's this internal contestation within these great traditions that spawns the most significant religion and religio-political movements of our day, from the violent extremist cadres of a group like Al-Qaeda to the organizations of militant peacemakers. So, to speak of this internal contestation brings us to my second of my 3 points. To an experience, the next point is to ask about the source of religion and religious self-understanding, and that source is in an experience of the sacred. Now, there are various ways over the course of the study of religion that people have described. What is religion? Where does it come from? And one, of course, can say it comes from God. And the model would be Moses comes off Mount Sinai with the tablets. And we are blank tablets until that happens, and we receive the revelation from God. The model that scholars follow in the study of religion, of course, is not that model. And it's a challenge, because the other challenge is to somehow leave God out of the question, and then you're not true to your agent self-description. There's a wonderfully gifted scholar, a scholar of Catholicism in this country named Robert Orsi, who wrote a book about Catholic women in the 20th century and their devotion to St. Jude. St. Jude is the patron of hopeless cases, hopeless causes. And Bob is a scholar. He has tenure at a major university, and he has to explain why these women continue generation after generation to pray to St. Jude and to give their money to a shrine in Chicago run by Claretian brothers, that is, by men, Catholic religious men, giving money to St. Jude and praying to St. Jude. And Orsi went and spoke to these women at various ages in their devotion to St. Jude. And for 8 chapters in that book, he's a wonderful ethnographer, very sympathetic to the women, and he describes their world. They were struggling with moving into the workforce after World War II. They were struggling because they had to support their families. They didn't want to necessarily. They were struggling with losing their husbands or their sons in wars, or to alcoholism, or to disability. And they would turn to this St. Jude for hope, for protection. They imagined him as a handsome Italian male and so on. There was quite a cult. And Orsi describes this with great insight. 8 chapters. Chapter 9, he says, now what do we make of this? How do we explain this phenomenon? He said, people who are less sophisticated or less attentive to these women than I am would say they were pawns of the religious men. That this is a system that is Catholic, patriarchal, male-dominated. They had this male saint, and they were giving money to these men in Chicago, these religious men, and it's really all about ways to reinstate patriarchy. But I, Bob Orsi, don't want to describe these women that way. In fact, as they imagined St. Jude into being, they were using their own agency. They weren't obeying the men. They were creating Jude themselves to help them take control, take authority in their families. And he uses the phrase, they were creating St. Jude, imagining them, St. Jude into being. And I said, Bob, what did the people who you studied think of the book? And I knew what he'd say. They loved the first 8 chapters. They hated chapter 9. Why? Because they said, yes, we were trying to assert authority and power and agency. That's true. And yes, we had to struggle with alcoholism and the job market and missing husbands and sons. But the thing you've missed is there is a St. Jude. There is a sacred. Now, Bob, nor I, nor anyone you're not going to get tenure in the modern university by saying the Holy Spirit did it or St. Jude did it. So the question becomes, how do we faithfully represent how people behave and do so in a way that sufficiently recognizes the complexity of motivation without excluding the possibility that there is a God. It's actually quite a challenge. And so we take the approach in the academy, which is somewhat inadequate, but it's the best we can do, is to say, and there's a lot to be said for this that is very rich and true to religion, we say that religion begins in an experience, and a particular kind of experience. And in a kind of classical form, it begins in an experience of the sacred that is powerful and that forms community and that transforms lives. And that experience gets mediated down the generations through prayer, through worship, through sacrament, through testimony, through preaching, a variety of ways and channels. But we're talking about an experience. And so this rooting of religion in a certain kind of experience of individuals and communities leads us to the second theme, which is the theme of hermeneutics and ambivalence. Hermeneutics and ambivalence. Let me explain what I mean there. So, most religions have interpreted, as I've said, their experience in such a way is as to respond to it paradoxically as religious people. This experience of God, of the sacred, of the holy. And they respond to it either by taking up the sword or by being militants for peace. These apparently contradictory orientations reflect a continuing struggle within the religious community and within the heart of each believer over the meaning and character of the power encountered in the sacred and its relationship to coercive force or violence. So what I'm arguing here is that ideas about violence and how it's used and when it's used and what justifies it or what prohibits it or forbids it, these arguments go back to what we think we're encountering when we encounter the sacred or the holy, a more generic term for God, if you will. There are many theorists of this, and I'm going to spare you the long lecture on that and go to one that I think was really, and is generally recognized as a very important early proponent or exponent of these ideas, who wrote not quite a century ago. His name was Rudolf Otto. In 1921, he was a German thinker, wrote a book called Das Heilige, which was translated in 1924 in this country into a book called The Idea of the Holy. The Idea of the Holy. And here I'm using the term the holy or the sacred interchangeably. And Otto had studied religious experiences that were formative for communities. He had studied accounts of people having what they described as experiences of the holy, back to so-called primitive religions, and in various parts of the world, even in the early modern and modern period. And he theorized about them. And to summarize too glibly, but that's all I can do now, is he said, these experiences, whatever cultural context they come from, there are many differences, and we can't blend them together, conflate them as if they were one. But they do have a common thread, a common set of elements. And the term he used, which became kind of famous among students of religion, is that the experience of the sacred is an experience of mysterium tremendum et fascinans. Now that'll be on your quiz. Did they tell you you can't leave tonight till you pass the quiz? Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. So let's break that down, the Latin. That is, the experience of the holy, the sacred, the God, is first mysterium, which seems obvious enough, mysterious, but the meaning here, the deep meaning of that term is an experience of something, a reality, an ultimate reality that is radically other. It's not me, it's not a tingle in my toes, it's not a sentiment that I create, it's not an idea of mine, it's not a fuzzy feeling around the campfire. This reality is other. It is radically not me, it is not us, and it's very real. Tremendum, well, tremendous, but the sense of the term tremendum is tremble. That is, this reality which is radically other and mysterious is soul-shaking. It frightens me, it overwhelms me. I'm in awe and even in dread of it, tremendum, because in the presence of this reality, I realize in a way I don't normally realize what a creature I am, how contingent, how finite, how created, because this reality is not. So I realize how vulnerable, what a limit experience I'm having, that is the experience of my own radical limits. I tremble. And then yet, even though this is radically other, and it's awe-inspiring and dreadful, fascinans is fascinating, or the sense is there's some element of recognition. These things don't seem to go together. Other, radically other, tremendous, but there's something fascinating, intriguing that draws me to it. And that was a very powerful expression of religious experience. What does this have to do with violence? Otto and many others after him in the study of religion said, this experience is an experience of awe, an experience of something uncreated, if you will, powerful, awesome, numinous, the term meaning ineffable, not able to be comprehended in words fully. And that experience is an experience that is pre-moral. That is, it doesn't come in 10 Commandments or the book of the law or simple precepts. Those precepts and teachings and practices and institutions are the reaction to something that's almost pre-verbal. Keats has a wonderful poem called On Reading Chapman's Homer, John Keats. And he's trying to describe what it was like for him to read this wonderful translation of Homer. And the last stanza of the poem talks about Magellan's men rounding the corner, so to speak, and seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time. And the last line of that poem is, silent upon a peak in Darien. Silence is the appropriate response to being awed, to being overwhelmed by the Pacific in that case, by a great work of art, by the sacred. So if silence is the reaction, we're not talking about someone who responds to the sacred and immediately writes a treatise or a dissertation or gives a long homily or talk. We're talking about those expressions as second-order expressions. They come later. What's experienced is something awesome, powerful, dramatic. And then the question becomes, how do we interpret it? That fancy word hermeneutics is another word for those of you who are not teaching in the academy on these questions. I know many of you already recognize it, some do not. That word hermeneutics simply talks about what is your theory of interpretation? How do you interpret experiences? How do you interpret a text? How do you understand what something means and what significance it has? Religion, the religious experience, is automatically an experience in need of interpretation. What is its context? What does it mean? One initial experience to this awesome mysterium tremendum et fascinans, one experience is awe, silence, reverence, worship, and the beginning of articulating that experience in doctrines or in teachings. Another is what we might call the Chicago aldermanic experience or reaction. How does the Chicago alderman? That would be called magic. We've got something here. How do we manipulate it? Mike Royko, the great political journalist, passed away some years ago, used to say that there should be a Latin phrase on the Chicago alderman's podium that says ubi meum, which in Latin means where's mine? And that's kind of one of the approaches. How do we exploit this? What do we get from this power? So right there are some very visceral reactions to this power. Of the internal dynamics shaping a religious community, the one most relevant to our topic of violence is that this experience creates ambivalence in the people experiencing it. It is a question of great power. How do I respond to this power? How do I change my life? What's the direction of the transformation? What are the circumstances under which this experience can be deployed, if you will? The Hebrew Scriptures, the book of Deuteronomy, presents this struggle in the starkest possible terms as a choice between life or death. It says, I have set before you life and death. What's the next line? Choose life. Now, that little phrase, and I've shortened it because the full thing, I set before you life and death, blessing and curses, therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. Deuteronomy 30:19, but in that shortened version, it's a powerful summary of what I'm saying. I set before you life and death. That is, the experience of the sacred is one of destruction or of healing, if you will, of great life or death. And then the choose life is an interpretation. It's a moral response. And it's encapsulated in what formula? Here's your option, life or death. Here's the awesome numinous power of the sacred. Choose this option. So our scriptures and our traditions don't simply present the choice. They have all kinds of commentary on what kind of choices to make. So, why do some people choose life? Why do some choose death? And we get it an answer by asking the further question, how do they interpret the experience? The scriptures, their preachers, their doctrines, the ways in which the experience is mediated to them. What is their hermeneutical strategy? How do they make sense of this vast, complicated reality? And that leads to the third and final theme, and I'll have some closing remarks before we have some questions. And that theme is internal pluralism and the discretion of leaders. So far we've said that religion evokes a militance, a self-sacrificial dedication, but it's not entirely clear what form that militance should take because the encounter with God is ambiguous. And it leads to ambivalent responses toward violence. We could go this way or that way. How do we determine? Because in fact, as we'll see now, the answers to that question in each of these traditions are multiple. They provide all kinds of options. And that's what I mean by the internal pluralism of these traditions. The fact that Christianity is internally plural, wildly plural. Sometimes people are taught that their faith, Christianity, Catholicism within it, the Baptist faith, whatever it may be, is set and solid, historically continuous, straightforward, direct. I mean, this, you know, if your job, if your vocation is to teach the gospel, you don't say, take your choice, you know, there are a lot of different options here. That hasn't been the American religious tradition most prominent. It's been to present the tradition as something usable, solid, stable, and so forth, when in fact, if we study the history of these traditions, we find them to be quite fluid, continually contested in their meanings. Religion is about internal contestation, and it's going on all the time. How many of you are Southern Baptists? I don't need to tell you about internal contestation. If you're Catholic, if you're Presbyterian, if you're Methodist, it happens all the time. Islam is currently undergoing a historic, epic, and internal contestation within Sunni and Shia Islam over the proper meaning of jihad and violence. In a current climate in which the nation state and various secular forces and various so-called Muslims, as some would say, have created the conditions under which violence looks like an appropriate response. It's an incredible internal debate, a different debate than Christians are having in different parts of the world. So the transcendent or ineffable, numinous, hard-to-express character of the sacred is often paired in the religious imagination with a surpassing power of creation and destruction. And that lends itself to almost guarantee not the response of polite, awed silence, but rather the babble of contestation over meaning. Interpretation is the name of the game, and it seldom occurs in the absence of some kind of struggle over power, or at least comparative advantage over theological rivals. In this sense, a religious tradition is constructed. I don't mean made up, but I mean the meaning of it is constantly being contested and built in a way. This is not to say God is being constructed or built, but how we interpret the sacred. It's transformed over time by ongoing argument and contestation within an often grueling process. What's going on while these things are being contested is all the believers are adapting to external circumstances. So Muslims in Egypt are adapting right now to a whole new set of circumstances. For the past 30 years, they've been adapting to the fact that the state, led by Mubarak, has put an iron grip of control over the authoritative religious leaders of Sunni Islam. Al-Azhar, which is the major Sunni university in Egypt, is like the Vatican, if you will, of the Sunni world. It's been completely co-opted by essentially a secular regime. And all of the religious leaders in Egypt work for the government unless they are jihadists, and then they attack the government. And that has created a set of circumstances that has put Islam in a terrible tizzy in the Sunni world, because it's not just Egypt that Sunni center controls and influences. So sacred sources, foundational texts, ethical injunctions, they are symbolic, they're elusive, and they generate an internal pluralism, internal, manifold, multivalent claims to meaning, truth, order, and structure. The possibility of constructing multiple arguments over meaning undergirds ceaseless contestation with any transnational or even any local religious community. So we want to understand how change occurs. And one way we know that change occurs and that contests take place is the role of religious leaders. And that's an entirely different category I won't elaborate on now. But because there's an array of possibilities within the traditions and the scriptures themselves, the interpreter is often the rabbi, the priest, the preacher, the prophet, the guru, or in the case of the jihadists in Sunni Islam, Osama bin Laden, he was trained for many years in a traditional school of Islamic philosophy and theology. No, not at all. He was an engineer, a business person. But he and his compatriots, so to speak, in Al-Qaeda and other jihadist networks claim that these religious leaders who were in authority had been co-opted by the state, and therefore leadership now has fallen upon the enlightened layperson. This is part of religious contestation in the late 20th, early 21st century, that traditional religious authorities have been co-opted by forces of compromise, of state, and purity has to come from new kinds of leadership. And so new leaders have emerged based on religious principles that are interpreted, and ethical injunctions are drawn from them. So this would be like me, a Catholic, issuing my own encyclical. Appleby says, birth control is fine, Catholics. Let me give you my reason. It would be like bin Laden saying, it's okay to kill innocents in America because the traditional constraints don't apply in this circumstance. Tomorrow I'll explain why that logic has any traction in the Islamic world. I want to say some things. I'm going to skip a section I'll return to tomorrow, that this internal contest, that I'll summarize very briefly now so we can get to questions. This internal contestation in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, today, other religions, has been exacerbated by globalization. The world's religions have always been transnational and global, but what is new is how rapid the interaction of peoples within traditions, but from different ethnic backgrounds, and across religious traditions is, how immediate it is, how cosmopolitan and multi-religious increasing numbers of societies are. The dynamism of international travel and migration and the widespread access, the web, cell phones, etc., to modes of personal communication across vast distances has led to unprecedented levels of intermingling and interaction between peoples who were once separated definitively by time and space, knowledge and culture. Globalism has fostered an unprecedented plurality, multiplicity of forms and expressions of religious behavior and belonging. Traditional boundaries long ago burst. Peter Berger, sociologist of religion, teaches at Boston University, in 1979 wrote a book called The Heretical Imperative, 79. Due to modern technology, we're all heretics now. We're all people who choose our own because we have a vast menu of possibilities. And other sociologists have pointed to that choice that is inevitable and the pluralism that comes from it. This new context for being religious, the decentering of religious authority, is having far-ranging impact in manners ranging from youth culture to the construction of so-called ethnic identity, to social values informing decisions about military policy, urban planning, and genetic engineering. There's also today a convergence of ambivalences about violence, should we use violence or not, and a heightened quest for justice. There's a rising tide of awareness of justice, the requirements of justice, and a debate, not only in his religious circles, about the role of violence there. This is complicated in turn by the diffusion of religious presences and the displacement of religious authorities who are traditional, who are being challenged, as I mentioned, by religious autodidacts, self-appointed leaders, and technocrats. So there are rapidly changing religious practices and affiliations owing to an accelerated syncretism, mixing and matching, blending of practices, and the proliferation of actual as well as virtual religious networks all over the world. Not least, they have enabled not only the spread and internal differentiation of forms of religious extremism, groups, movements, networks, and organizations whose ideology holds that the use of lethal violence against apostates and encroaching non-believers is a sacred duty or obligation. Okay, let me conclude then with two comments. I'm skipping a little bit. I'll come back to tomorrow, but I do hope we can have a few minutes at least for discussion. Tomorrow's lecture, I'll try to provide more details and examples and a map of some of the patterns of religious violence and religious peace building in the world today by taking you around the world, so to speak, to illustrate these. Today, two concluding comments before we discuss. One of the questions I suggested at the outset is the question of whether religious violence in the world today is worse somehow than other forms of violence, state violence, sectarian violence, or I should say political violence. And there's a debate on this. There are some scholars of extremisms, political and religious, who would say there really isn't much different about violence that's motivated by religion. In fact, religion is, I'll indicate more tomorrow in this school of thought, religion is tacked on. It's brought into conflicts that are really about territory or oil or governance or ethnic hatred. For example, there's a very influential, in my mind, two influential political scientists named Robert Pape from the University of Chicago, who said, you know what suicide bombing is about in the Islamic world and elsewhere? It's really not about religion. It's about driving out people who occupy your homeland. It's just an effective method, and religion really is not part of it. They might wear religious garb or make religious statements, but it's really about driving an occupying army, whether it's Israeli or American, whatever it may be, or British. That's what suicide bombing, it's a tactic of military strategy, pure and simple. There's another school of thought that would argue that, quite the contrary, religious violence is more deadly, more enduring, and more likely to recur frequently in places from the Middle East to Southeast Asia to Latin America to parts of the United States. And that's because the religious calculation of what's at stake is very different from calculations made by state actors or secular actors. They may say, we're doing violence because we want this piece of territory or we want to depose this ruler. In other words, their goals are temporal. They're time-bound, they're specific, they're material goals. They may be complicated, they may take years to achieve. By contrast, this school of thought says the religious actors who do violence, who are truly religious, are drawing upon apocalyptic and millennial and religious imagination that is really about doing God's will and defending God's purposes on a longer-term plane temporally. This is a generational. This theory is called the theory of cosmic war, that many of the religiously inspired actors around the world, Christians as well as Jews, Hindus as well as Muslims, really understand history and God's will by a very different time scheme. They're not fighting necessarily for this battle. They realize God is on their side, or so they believe, and the battle has to continue and endure and replenish itself because God is at the source of it, and it's a cosmic battle of good versus evil. Concluding remarks. The Cole Lectures were established for the defense and advocacy of the Christian religion. Let me conclude by addressing the defense and advocacy mandate to stay in the tradition. I'm going to talk tomorrow about strong and weak religions and the manipulation of religion. And there are many ways that religion gets manipulated. There are a lot of isms, modernisms, fundamentalisms, and so on. I place myself in the category, if I have to be an ist or an ism, I'm a traditionalist, and I embrace traditionalism. And that's very difficult. Traditionalist doesn't mean old-fashioned. It means that I try, and those like me try, to be faithful to the tradition. And the problem with that is that the tradition, Christianity in my case, it's not as easy to be faithful to a tradition when it's this ambiguous, multivalent, so many different voices, so many arguments over the centuries about what the meaning of Christ is, what are the sacraments, what is true religious authority. It's internally plural, it's contested. Even in the New Testament, in one passage, Jesus is saying, if you're not with us and you're against us. A little bit later, he says the opposite. What is it, Lord? There are internal contradictions even in the Scriptures. A traditionalist lives with the ambiguity. A traditionalist might be called Israel, and I don't mean this nation state. I mean the one who struggles with the angel, who is called Jacob, called Israel, because he's up all night struggling with this angel. I will not let you go until you bless me, he says. And Israel means one who has struggled with the angel, with God, and endured. A traditionalist is a struggler. A traditionalist lives with ambiguity. A traditionalist tries to be faithful to a reality that is ambiguous, not always delineated in the lines of an engineer or a simple precept or a doctrine. The defense and advocacy of the Christian religion, in my opinion, is the defense and advocacy of fidelity to the tradition in all its messiness. Thanks for your attention. I hope we have a few minutes for questions. I will come down to see you and talk to you about them.